Sometimes the bravest warning sounds like nothing more than an old dog refusing to move. The morning air drifting across Victoria Harbour carries the scent of cedar, salt water, damp stone, and fresh coffee as Constable Nolan Mercer arrives long before sunrise in his dark navy police uniform, his polished boots echoing softly across the nearly empty civic square. Beside him walks Atlas, a 10-year-old German shepherd whose clouded eyes have not seen daylight in years but whose steady pace never suggests uncertainty. The city is preparing for the arrival of the Governor of British Columbia, and officers move through their checklists with practiced efficiency while television crews unpack cameras and municipal workers adjust barriers. Nolan keeps one hand loosely on Atlas's leather lead, trusting the dog to choose his own rhythm. They have worked together for so many years that silence often says more than commands. Atlas suddenly stops. His ears rise toward a glass office tower overlooking the square. His nose lifts into the breeze, drawing in invisible threads carried from above. He does not bark. He simply stands as though rooted into the pavement. A pair of younger officers notice the pause and exchange amused smiles. One mutters that the old blind dog must have heard a pigeon landing on the roof. Another quietly jokes that retirement should have arrived years ago. Soft laughter spreads between them, disappearing into the cool coastal wind. Nolan does not answer. He has witnessed Atlas locate missing hikers beneath heavy snowfall, detect hidden evidence beneath collapsed structures, and guide frightened civilians through darkness using nothing except scent and instinct. He knows the difference between confusion and certainty. Atlas slowly turns his head several degrees toward the upper floors of the tower and releases a low rumble that almost disappears beneath the hum of delivery trucks setting up for the event. Nolan kneels beside him and rests a reassuring hand against the thick sable fur around his neck. "What are you trying to tell me, partner?" Atlas remains completely still. Around them, crews continue decorating the stage while banners ripple gently against the pale Canadian sky. A radio crackles with routine updates. Somewhere high above, a faint metallic click echoes between buildings, too distant for most people to notice. Atlas reacts instantly. His breathing slows. His ears sharpen toward the sound. Then another breeze arrives from the direction of the tower carrying an unfamiliar combination of odors that causes the old German shepherd to stiffen. It is not a strong smell, only the slightest trace of lubricating oil mixed with industrial solvent and freshly handled synthetic fabric. Nolan cannot identify it himself, but Atlas has already decided it does not belong. The dog steps sideways until he blocks Nolan's path, refusing to continue toward the ceremony site. A supervisor walks over, glances at the motionless German shepherd, and smiles politely. Looks like he found a comfortable place to rest. Nolan forces a small smile in return but keeps watching Atlas. The dog's clouded eyes face the same section of rooftop without wavering, guided by senses that no longer depend on vision. Spectators begin gathering behind barriers while reporters rehearse introductions and camera lenses reflect the growing daylight. To everyone else, the square feels peaceful, orderly, and completely secure. Only Atlas behaves as though something unseen has already arrived. Nolan slowly rises to his feet and follows the invisible line of the dog's attention toward the office tower, feeling a quiet unease settle in his chest. He cannot explain why, yet years of shared experience whisper the same message again and again. Atlas has never been afraid of shadows. He only stops when danger is real, and this morning he refuses to take another step. Constable Nolan Mercer never argued with people who laughed at Atlas because experience had taught him that disbelief often disappeared the moment reality arrived. He kept one hand resting lightly against the old German shepherd's shoulder while the activity around the civic square continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Volunteers unfolded rows of chairs, technicians tested microphones, and local officials reviewed schedules beneath gray Canadian skies that threatened afternoon rain. Atlas ignored every voice around him. His nose remained lifted toward the breeze, collecting invisible fragments that drifted from somewhere high above the street. Nolan quietly loosened the lead, allowing the dog enough space to investigate without breaking formation. Atlas advanced only 3 careful steps before stopping again. His ears angled toward the same office tower, then toward a rooftop ventilation unit, then back once more, tracing a pattern too deliberate to dismiss as confusion. Watching him stirred memories Nolan carried with absolute clarity. Years earlier Atlas had been one of the finest detection dogs in the province, capable of locating concealed evidence beneath collapsed timber and identifying hidden weapons caches during carefully planned police operations. During one dangerous assignment, the German Shepherd had protected another officer from unexpected exposure to hazardous materials, surviving but losing his eyesight forever. Specialists believed his career had ended that day. Nolan disagreed. Rehabilitation had revealed something remarkable. Deprived of vision, Atlas compensated with extraordinary precision in hearing and scent discrimination, recognizing subtle chemical traces and distant mechanical sounds long before most equipment detected them. The partnership evolved instead of ending. Back in the present, Superintendent Grace Donnelly approached carrying updated security notes. She glanced at Atlas with measured concern rather than mockery. Still focused on that building, she asked quietly. Nolan nodded. He is tracking something specific. Grace studied the windows catching pale morning light and replied that maintenance crews had inspected public access areas before dawn. Nothing suspicious had been reported. Nolan accepted the information but remained unconvinced. Atlas suddenly inhaled deeply and turned left, guiding Nolan toward a service corridor running behind decorative planters filled with damp cedar mulch and white flowers. There the dog paused beside a drainage grate, lowering his head as though sorting scents trapped in cool air rising from below. Nearby a pair of younger constables exchanged amused expressions. One suggested the blind dog had discovered spilled coffee. Another wondered aloud whether retirement ceremonies should include biscuits instead of medals. Nolan neither smiled nor frowned. He simply watched Atlas continue his quiet examination. A gust swept through the corridor carrying the unmistakable smell of lubricating oil mixed with solvent used to clean precision metal components. Nolan noticed nothing unusual himself except Atlas freezing in place. The German Shepherd's breathing slowed until it was almost impossible to hear. His muscles tightened beneath weathered fur. Then came another tiny sound, no louder than a coin touching glass, echoing faintly from somewhere above. Atlas immediately shifted his head upward. Nolan followed the invisible line and saw only mirrored windows reflecting clouds and flags. "Grace," he said into his radio with calm urgency, "I would like another look at the upper maintenance levels." The request was acknowledged but not treated as an emergency. Resources were already committed to the governor's arrival, and no visual evidence supported expanding the search. Atlas remained motionless through every exchange. Around them reporters rehearsed opening lines while police motorcycles prepared to escort the official convoy. Ordinary life flowed uninterrupted across the square, yet Nolan felt the same certainty growing inside him that had saved lives before. Atlas did not understand politics or ceremony. He understood patterns, sense, and danger, and on this quiet morning beside the harbor he was trying with every patient breath to warn the only people capable of listening before time quietly slipped away. Constable Nolan Mercer watched the preparations accelerate while Atlas seemed to move in the opposite direction, becoming quieter with every passing minute instead of more agitated. That silence unsettled him more than any bark ever could. The old German Shepherd slowly guided him toward the base of the office tower overlooking the square, stopping beside a row of steel ventilation grills where cool air drifted outward carrying traces that no ordinary passerby would notice. Atlas inhaled once, then twice, his ears rotating independently as though mapping invisible currents. Nolan crouched beside him and studied the blank concrete walls rising several stories above. Nothing appeared unusual. Office lights glowed behind reflective glass, maintenance blinds hung neatly in place, and cleaning staff could be seen moving through lower corridors with carts and buckets. Yet Atlas refused to leave. Superintendent Grace Donnelly arrived with another officer carrying updated security reports. "The rooftop doors are locked and monitored," she explained. Building management confirmed no scheduled activity above the public floors. Nolan listened respectfully before looking back at Atlas. The German Shepherd's nose remained pointed toward the same upper corner of the structure. Grace sighed softly and agreed to dispatch another patrol to inspect service access points, though she cautioned that the governor's convoy was less than 30 minutes away and resources were tightening. While officers entered the building, Atlas unexpectedly shifted his attention toward the wind itself. A stronger breeze swept between neighboring towers, bringing with it a sharper version of the unfamiliar scent already troubling him. Nolan could not identify it beyond something mechanical, but Atlas reacted immediately by stepping in front of him and blocking his path. The dog's breathing slowed until each inhale seemed measured with careful intent. A nearby constable laughed and suggested that construction workers probably lubricated rooftop machinery before dawn. Another joked that a blind dog could hardly distinguish one smell from another in a downtown core filled with traffic. Nolan ignored them. He remembered reading reports from veterinary specialists explaining that a trained German Shepherd possessed scent discrimination far beyond ordinary human capability, especially after years of operational conditioning. Atlas had never alerted without reason. Minutes later the inspection team radioed back. Every accessible corridor appeared secure. The roof entrance showed no signs of forced entry. Utility rooms contained only authorized equipment. Grace thanked the officers and prepared to close the matter, but before she could speak Atlas jerked his head sharply upward. A faint metallic scrape drifted through the air, lasting no more than a heartbeat before disappearing beneath city noise. Nolan heard almost nothing. Atlas heard enough. The old dog emitted a low warning unlike fear or aggression, a restrained vibration carrying quiet certainty. Nolan requested permission to inspect the upper maintenance level personally, but protocol required him to remain with the governor's protection detail. The answer came back polite yet firm. Hold position. Trust the completed search. Around them photographers adjusted long camera lenses while reporters practiced introductions facing the stage. Delivery crews removed final barricades and volunteers straightened provincial flags fluttering against an overcast sky. Atlas then did something he almost never did. He pulled hard on the leather lead, not toward the crowd but toward the building entrance, planting every kilogram of his weight against Nolan's arm with determined persistence. Nolan resisted only enough to avoid causing a disturbance. He leaned close and whispered, "I know you are trying to tell me something." Atlas relaxed for one brief second before lifting his nose again. Another invisible ribbon of air drifted downward carrying the same combination of lubricating oil, solvent, and synthetic fabric. The German Shepherd froze completely, facing the rooftop with unwavering conviction while everyone else turned their attention toward the approaching motorcade, unaware that the most important warning of the morning was being delivered by the only witness nobody fully believed. The city seemed to breathe in perfect rhythm while Atlas alone remained out of step with everyone around him. Constable Nolan Mercer stood quietly beside the old German Shepherd as final preparations transformed the civic square into a polished stage for the governor's arrival. Rows of chairs filled with invited guests, television crews adjusted focus rings beneath overcast skies, and police motorcycles waited along the curb with engines idling softly. Everything appeared orderly. Everything looked exactly as it should. Atlas lowered his head until his nose nearly touched the damp pavement, then slowly lifted it again toward the rooftop where the unfamiliar scent continued, drifting downward in fragile waves. The breeze shifted from west to east, carrying traces of lubricating oil, cleaning solvent, and synthetic fabric before scattering them into the open air. Nolan watched the subtle change in the dog's posture and felt his own unease deepen. This was not random curiosity. Atlas was building certainty one breath at a time. Superintendent Grace Donnelly approached holding an updated security tablet and informed Nolan that the secondary inspection team had completed another sweep. Maintenance corridors, utility spaces, elevators, and authorized access points showed nothing suspicious. Building management insisted no contractors were working above the occupied offices. Grace spoke with confidence born from procedure, but she noticed Atlas refusing to relax. "If your partner could explain himself, today would be much easier," she said quietly. Nolan answered without taking his eyes from the tower. "He already is. We are the ones struggling to understand." Nearby, several younger officers continued exchanging light remarks about the blind dog's stubbornness. One suggested Atlas simply disliked tall buildings. Another pointed toward rooftop ventilation units and blamed unfamiliar machinery. Their voices carried no cruelty, only misplaced certainty, yet each casual dismissal tightened something inside Nolan's chest. Atlas suddenly pivoted and pulled toward the service entrance leading into the office building. The leather lead stretched taut. Nolan followed for several meters before another security coordinator intercepted them, reminding him that the governor's convoy was now less than 15 minutes away and all assigned personnel needed to remain in position. Reluctantly Nolan stopped, but Atlas refused. The German Shepherd leaned forward with every kilogram of determination left in his aging body, paws planted firmly against wet stone as though invisible danger waited only meters beyond the locked doors. At that moment a faint metallic scrape floated through the breeze, followed by a sound so slight that Nolan almost mistook it for construction somewhere across the harbor. Atlas did not hesitate. His ears snapped toward the rooftop and remained fixed there. Grace noticed the reaction and radioed building security one final time, requesting visual confirmation from the upper mechanical level. Minutes passed. The reply eventually returned calm and reassuring. Nothing unusual observed. No unauthorized personnel visible. The report eased tension among the command staff but accomplished nothing for Atlas. Instead, the old dog quietly sat facing the building, every muscle alert despite complete stillness. Spectators continued arriving with umbrellas folded beneath their arms, while local musicians tuned instruments near the stage. A child's balloon escaped into the sky and drifted harmlessly above the square before disappearing between towers, drawing smiles from the crowd. Atlas never looked toward it. He remained focused only on the unseen place where scent, sound, and instinct converged. Nolan knelt beside him and rested both hands on the weathered harness. He could feel the slow rise and fall of Atlas's breathing, steady but purposeful, like someone waiting for a train already heard long before it entered the station. Across the avenue, the first escort motorcycles became visible in the distance, their polished lights reflecting against rain-darkened pavement. Around them, conversations shifted toward welcoming speeches and ceremonial timing, yet Atlas seemed to retreat into profound silence, as though every lesson earned through 10 years of service had led to this single morning and this single rooftop that nobody else believed deserved another look. The first police motorcycles appeared at the far end of the avenue just as a stronger gust swept through the downtown corridor, bending the ceremonial flags and carrying with it a sharper ribbon of unfamiliar scent. Atlas reacted before anyone else. His head lifted abruptly, his ears fixed on the rooftop above the office tower, and every muscle along his aging frame became rigid. Constable Nolan Mercer felt the change through the leather lead as clearly as if electricity had passed between them. The old German shepherd did not bark wildly or lunge in panic. Instead, he pulled with unwavering purpose toward the secured entrance of the building, stopping only long enough to sniff the air again before straining forward once more. Nolan followed several steps, his instincts urging him to trust the partner who had never once manufactured danger. Behind them, Superintendent Grace Donnelly called his name, reminding him that the governor's convoy would enter the square within minutes and every assigned officer had to remain in formation. Nolan hesitated. Duty demanded obedience to procedure, but years beside Atlas had taught him that the dog's quiet certainty deserved respect. Around them, the public saw only routine preparations. Reporters adjusted microphones. Camera operators framed the podium against the skyline. Municipal staff smiled while greeting invited guests. A pair of young constables exchanged another amused glance when Atlas refused to return to position. One whispered that perhaps the blind dog had caught the smell of rooftop machinery warming in the morning air. Another shrugged and joked that retirement would solve the problem. Nolan ignored them and knelt beside Atlas instead. The German shepherd pressed his nose into the breeze again and released a low vibration deep in his chest, not aggressive, not frightened, but insistent. At that exact moment, another nearly imperceptible metallic sound drifted downward, followed by the faint scrape of something being adjusted against concrete high above. Nolan looked upward but saw only mirrored windows reflecting pale clouds. Atlas suddenly pivoted away from the building and began pulling toward a narrow service stairwell leading to restricted maintenance access. He had never walked that route before, yet he moved with complete confidence, pausing at the locked gate and placing one paw against the bottom step as though trying to guide Nolan upward. Grace arrived seconds later with a ring of access cards clipped to her belt. She studied Atlas carefully, then radioed building security requesting immediate confirmation that no unauthorized personnel occupied the roof. The answer returned after an anxious pause. The electronic locks showed no alarms. Surveillance cameras displayed nothing unusual. The report satisfied everyone except the old German shepherd. He refused to leave the stairwell. A fresh breeze descended the shaft carrying once again the unmistakable combination of lubricating oil, industrial solvent, and synthetic material that Atlas had been tracking all morning. Nolan leaned closer, inhaling deeply. He still could not distinguish the scents himself, but he trusted what Atlas sensed. "Please," he quietly told Grace, "give us 5 minutes to inspect above." She checked the time and looked toward the approaching escort vehicles now visible beyond the intersection. Delaying the governor's carefully coordinated arrival would create confusion throughout the security operation. After a difficult pause, she shook her head with visible regret. "We cannot hold the schedule without evidence." Nolan nodded reluctantly, clipped the lead shorter, and guided Atlas away from the stairwell. The German shepherd resisted for only an instant before falling into step beside him, though his ears never left the rooftop. As applause began rising from spectators welcoming the approaching motorcade, Atlas turned his clouded eyes toward the tower one final time and released the quietest warning of the morning, a sound so soft that only Nolan heard it, yet heavy enough to leave an unshakable weight settling over his heart. The governor's convoy rolled into the square beneath a sky that had turned the color of brushed steel, and polite applause rose from the gathered crowd as motorcycles eased into position with practiced precision. Constable Nolan Mercer took his assigned place near the front security corridor, yet his attention never drifted far from Atlas. The old German shepherd walked beside him with measured steps, his clouded eyes fixed on nothing visible while his ears and nose searched a world hidden from everyone else. As Governor Elaine Whitmore stepped from her vehicle and greeted local officials with a calm smile, Atlas suddenly stopped so abruptly that the leather lead snapped tight. He inhaled deeply once, then twice, and an unfamiliar tension spread through his body. Nolan felt it instantly. Before he could react, Atlas pulled sideways with surprising strength and forced Nolan several meters off the planned route. Nearby officers glanced over in confusion, believing the blind dog had simply lost orientation in the growing noise. A few reached for their radios, expecting Nolan to regain control within seconds. Instead, Atlas lowered his head toward the pavement, then swung it sharply upward toward the rooftop he had been tracking since dawn. At almost the same moment a brief flash caught Nolan's eye high above the square. It lasted less than a heartbeat, no brighter than sunlight reflecting from polished glass, but it appeared exactly where Atlas had been warning all morning. Nolan froze. His instincts finally aligned with the dog's unwavering certainty. He shouted for everyone nearby to move away from the open line of sight while simultaneously reaching for his radio. The words had barely left his mouth when Atlas surged forward with every remaining reserve of strength in his aging body. The German shepherd drove directly across the space between Nolan and the governor, striking Nolan's legs and forcing him sideways while also disrupting the governor's intended path toward the podium. The sudden movement startled nearby officials, who instinctively stepped back and formed an uneven cluster rather than continuing along the original route. Security officers reacted immediately, surrounding the governor and redirecting her toward a more protected position while others looked toward the rooftop that Nolan had indicated. Atlas remained in front of them, refusing to retreat despite repeated commands. Then another faint metallic sound drifted downward through the wind, confirming what his senses had recognized long before human eyes noticed anything unusual. Additional officers rushed toward the office building and sealed the entrances while rooftop access teams accelerated their response. The public, unaware of the precise reason, was calmly instructed to remain behind barriers as event staff announced a brief operational pause. Amid the controlled confusion, Atlas stumbled for the first time all morning. Nolan dropped to one knee beside him and wrapped both hands around the familiar harness. The old dog's breathing had become shallow from the tremendous burst of effort, but he still angled his ears toward the roof, unwilling to abandon his silent watch. Grace Donnelly reached them moments later, her expression transformed from professional confidence to quiet disbelief. He knew, she whispered almost to herself. Nolan nodded without taking his eyes from Atlas. He has been trying to tell us since sunrise. Above them the response teams continued moving across the building while below the square remained suspended in uneasy silence, the celebration forgotten beneath gathering clouds. Rain began falling in soft, cold drops that darkened the pavement and settled across Atlas's graying fur. The old German shepherd rested his head briefly against Nolan's arm, not in surrender but in exhausted reassurance, as though he believed his message had finally reached the people who needed to hear it, even if it had taken nearly the entire morning for anyone besides his partner to truly listen. Rain continued to fall across the square in gentle waves as emergency response teams secured the surrounding buildings with disciplined precision, replacing celebration with controlled silence. Constable Nolan Mercer remained beside Atlas, one hand resting on the old German shepherd's weathered harness while officers moved quickly through stairwells and maintenance corridors above. Within minutes the rooftop search team transmitted the message everyone had feared and yet somehow still struggled to believe. Hidden behind mechanical equipment and carefully positioned near the edge of the building, they discovered evidence confirming that an unauthorized individual had prepared a concealed observation point overlooking the governor's route. Specialized equipment, protective fabric, cleaning materials, and traces of lubricating oil matched the exact scents Atlas had followed since dawn. Nolan closed his eyes for a brief moment as the realization settled over him. Atlas had understood the danger long before any human investigation produced proof. Superintendent Grace Donnelly stood motionless beneath the drizzle, listening to updates through her radio while replaying every request Nolan had made during the morning. She remembered the repeated suggestions to inspect the rooftop more thoroughly, the quiet warnings, the insistence that the dog's behavior was different this time. Procedure had delayed action until visual confirmation existed, and now confirmation had finally arrived only because Atlas refused to abandon his instincts. Around them the younger officers who had joked about retirement no longer spoke. One removed his cap and stared silently at the office tower. Another walked over to Atlas, knelt carefully, and placed a trembling hand against the old dog's shoulder before whispering an apology that carried more regret than words could express. Atlas acknowledged the touch with only the slightest movement of his ears. His breathing remained slow, but Nolan noticed a fatigue deeper than physical exhaustion. The tremendous effort of pulling against commands, tracking elusive scents through changing winds, and remaining constantly alert had drained every reserve the aging German Shepherd possessed. Governor Elaine Whitmore, now safely relocated inside a secure municipal building, requested a private update rather than a public statement. When informed that the first meaningful warning had come from a blind service dog dismissed by many as too old to contribute, she fell silent for several seconds before quietly instructing staff to postpone all ceremonial remarks. Some debts cannot be repaid with speeches, she said. Investigators continued documenting the rooftop, discovering synthetic coverings, metal adjustment tools, and cleaning residue that explained every scent Atlas had identified. The pattern became painfully clear. Each clue had existed in plain reality, but only one living being had assembled them into certainty before the evidence became visible. Nolan remained beside Atlas as paramedics offered precautionary veterinary assessment. The old German Shepherd accepted gentle examination without resistance, though his attention never drifted from the direction of the rooftop. Even now he seemed unwilling to believe the danger had fully passed. Nolan stroked the familiar graying fur behind his ears and whispered, "You carried this burden alone all morning." Atlas leaned faintly into his hand before resting against his leg. The rain softened until only scattered drops remained, leaving the pavement glistening beneath muted afternoon light. Around the square officers quietly resumed protective positions while forensic teams worked above, but the atmosphere had changed forever. The laughter that greeted Atlas at sunrise had vanished completely, replaced by a heavy silence shared by everyone who now understood the same uncomfortable truth. The old German Shepherd had never been confused, stubborn, or frightened. He had simply been right, and the realization arrived with a painful weight that settled over every witness, because all of them knew that if they had trusted him sooner, the morning might have unfolded with far less fear and far less regret than it already carried in the quiet Canadian rain. The following morning the rain had stopped, but the weight left behind by the previous day seemed to linger over every stone walkway and every harbor breeze moving through Victoria. Constable Nolan Mercer sat quietly beside Atlas inside the regional veterinary hospital where soft lights, clean blankets, and the gentle scent of antiseptic replaced the noise of sirens and radios. Veterinarians moved with calm professionalism, explaining that the old German Shepherd had exhausted himself beyond anything they had expected for a dog of his age and medical history. Years of faithful service, blindness, relentless concentration, and the extraordinary effort he had poured into protecting others had taken a severe toll on his aging body. Nolan listened without interrupting, one hand resting on Atlas's paw while the dog breathed slowly, comforted only by familiar touch and the sound of the voice he had trusted throughout his life. Word of what had happened spread quietly through the police service. Officers who had once smiled at the blind dog's stubborn behavior arrived one by one, not carrying speeches or cameras but coffee for Nolan, flowers for the staff, and silent expressions they struggled to explain. One young constable who had joked about retirement stood outside the room for nearly 10 minutes before entering. He removed his cap, knelt beside Atlas, and whispered that he wished he had listened instead of laughing. The old German Shepherd lifted his ears just enough to recognize the voice before settling again into peaceful stillness. Superintendent Grace Donnelly arrived carrying the weathered leather lead that had slipped from Nolan's hands during the confusion in the square. She placed it carefully beside the bed without saying anything for several moments. Finally she admitted that the investigation had reached an unavoidable conclusion. Every scent Atlas had followed matched evidence recovered from the rooftop, from lubricants used on specialized equipment to residue from cleaning solvents and fibers from concealed coverings. Security analysts agreed that no routine visual inspection had been likely to detect those details in time. Atlas had assembled the truth from fragments invisible to everyone else. Governor Elaine Whitmore requested permission to visit privately that afternoon. Entering without ceremony, she approached the resting dog slowly and thanked him in a voice barely above a whisper. She explained that countless people would return safely to their families because one faithful guardian refused to ignore his instincts. Nolan lowered his head, unable to answer. Outside the room, television crews waited for official statements, but inside there was only the quiet rhythm of breathing and the distant sound of rainwater dripping from hospital eaves. Hours passed gently until Atlas stirred and shifted closer to Nolan's hand. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, yet everyone nearby paused to watch. Nolan leaned forward and spoke softly about the harbor walks they had shared, the mountain searches they had completed, and the many strangers who would never know how often the old German shepherd had protected them without recognition. Atlas's tail brushed the blanket once before becoming still again. No dramatic farewell filled the room. Instead there was only a profound calm that settled over every witness, as though the dog understood his work was finally complete. By evening the hallway outside had filled with uniformed officers standing shoulder to shoulder in respectful silence. Nobody issued commands. Nobody asked for photographs. They simply remained there because leaving felt impossible. Looking through the doorway at the aging German shepherd resting peacefully beside his lifelong partner, each of them carried the same quiet burden into the fading Canadian light. They had eventually believed Atlas, but belief had arrived only after he had already given everything he possessed to make them understand, and that realization would stay with them far longer than any report, medal, or ceremony ever could. Winter settled over Victoria with quiet dignity, covering rooftops in pale frost and wrapping the harbor in a veil of mist that softened every distant light. Weeks had passed since the day Atlas changed the course of countless lives, and although the official investigation had been completed, no one inside the police service seemed eager to speak of it in ordinary conversation. Some memories carried too much weight for casual words. Constable Nolan Mercer returned to duty, but the familiar leather lead no longer rested in his hand during morning patrols. It remained carefully folded inside his locker beside a worn service harness that still carried the faint scent of cedar, rain, and the faithful companion who had trusted his instincts until the very end. The veterinary hospital had done everything possible, yet Atlas quietly slipped away surrounded by the only voices he had ever needed to hear. There had been no dramatic struggle, no spectacle, only a peaceful final rest with Nolan's hand against his shoulder and whispered gratitude filling the silence between them. The funeral procession was unlike anything many officers had witnessed. Uniformed men and women stood shoulder to shoulder beneath gray Canadian skies while flags moved gently in the wind and church bells echoed across the waterfront. Governor Elaine Whitmore attended without fanfare, placing a single white flower beside Atlas's service collar before stepping back in silence. Superintendent Grace Donnelly read only one sentence from the official report, explaining that the earliest credible warning had come from the blind German shepherd whose observations matched evidence later confirmed by investigators. Then she closed the folder without another word. None were necessary. In the months that followed, recruits entering the Provincial Police Academy were brought to a modest bronze statue overlooking a training courtyard. It did not depict triumph or action. Instead it showed an aging German shepherd sitting calmly with ears raised toward an unseen sound carried on the wind. At the base of the monument a simple inscription read, "Listen before certainty arrives too late." Every instructor paused there for a moment before beginning lessons, reminding future officers that evidence sometimes begins with experience and that wisdom occasionally arrives on 4 quiet paws. Nolan visited the statue often after evening shifts. He never stayed long. He would brush snow from the bronze ears, place one gloved hand against the cold metal, and remember the countless mornings when Atlas had guided him without asking for recognition. Sometimes passing officers stopped beside him, embarrassed by memories of careless jokes spoken before they understood the truth. Nolan never blamed them. He simply told them to pay closer attention the next time an experienced partner refused to ignore something that could not yet be explained. Along the harbor the gulls still circled above dark water, ferries still crossed beneath pale dawn skies, and cedar-scented winds still moved between the same buildings where Atlas had first lifted his nose and quietly warned everyone around him. The city carried on, yet something invisible had changed forever. Procedures were rewritten. Rooftop inspections became more thorough. Canine observations received greater respect regardless of appearances. The greatest lesson, however, lived not inside policy manuals but inside the hearts of those who had stood in the square that morning. They realized that the blind dog had never needed sight to recognize danger, while they had possessed perfect vision and still failed to understand until precious moments nearly slipped away. And whenever Nolan walked home beneath the evening lights reflecting across Victoria Harbor, he could almost imagine steady paws keeping pace beside him, reminding him with every silent step that loyalty asks for nothing in return except to be trusted before it is gone.